For 6 months, she smelled like vanilla and orchids. She baked sourdough bread on Sundays and apologized whenever she bumped into the furniture. I was a hardened alpha security contractor, and Harper was my anchor to a quiet, normal life. But right now, my blood is pooling on the freezing concrete of a Chicago alley. An AR-15 rifle is pointed directly at my skull. I am ready to take the bullet and die to protect her. Then, my sweet, trembling Omega steps out from the shadows. She doesn't scream, and she doesn't run. She looks at the 4 armed killers with absolute chilling boredom, and with a voice I have never heard before, she orders them to drop their weapons and kneel. Blood tasted like cheap copper and regret. I spat a mouthful of it onto the wet asphalt of the West Loop alley. The cold Chicago rain washed it away almost instantly, but it couldn't wash away the throbbing pain in my ribs. I leaned heavily against the brick wall of a closed-down warehouse. My breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. Every instinct in my alpha biology was screaming at me to fight, to tear throats, to protect, but my vision was blurring at the edges. I focused on the girl cowering behind the rusted dumpster. Harper. Even through the stench of garbage, gunpowder, and my own blood, I could smell her. Vanilla and petrichor. It was the scent of a frightened Omega. It was the scent I had woken up to for the past 6 months. I tightened my grip on the combat knife in my right hand. I had dropped my Sig Sauer pistol somewhere in the dark when the first SUV rammed into my truck. There were 4 of them left. Heavy boots splashed in the puddles, closing in on our position. They were professionals, moving in a practiced tactical wedge. "Stay down, Harper," I whispered, my voice rough like sandpaper. She didn't make a sound, just curled tighter into my oversized leather jacket. 6 months ago, I met her at the Garfield Park Conservatory. She was a botanist specializing in rare orchids. I was a private security contractor trying to find a quiet place to eat a sandwich. She had smiled at me, dropped a pot of soil, and apologized profusely. I caught the pot before it hit the ground. That was it. That was the start. I was a cynical, hard-edged alpha who trusted no one. She was a soft-spoken Omega who baked me sourdough bread and dragged me to farmers' markets on Sunday mornings. She was my anchor to a normal life. And now, my past had apparently caught up with me, and I was going to get her killed. "Come out, Sloane," a voice echoed down the alley. It was a man's voice, thick with a subtle East Coast accent. "You put up a good fight, but it's over." I calculated my odds. 4 armed men, wide angles of approach, night vision likely. I had a 6-inch blade, 3 broken ribs, and a concussion. The odds were 0. But an alpha doesn't calculate odds when her mate is in danger. I pushed myself off the brick wall. My left arm hung uselessly at my side. I stepped out from the cover of the dumpster, placing myself squarely between the gunman and Harper. The rain plastered my hair to my forehead. 4 tactical flashlights blinded me instantly. I squinted, holding the knife low, ready for a lethal strike. "I don't know who sent you," I growled, projecting my voice over the rain. "But if you let the girl walk, I'll surrender." The men stopped their advance. They were wearing dark tactical gear, faces covered by balaclavas. The man in the center lowered his flashlight slightly. "We don't negotiate with dead women," he said flatly. He raised an AR-15 rifle and aimed it directly at my chest. I braced for the impact. I hoped it would be quick. I hoped Harper would run while they checked my body. "Drop the weapon, Marcus." The voice came from behind me. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. But it cut through the sound of the rain and the roaring traffic from the Kennedy Expressway like a razor blade. It was Harper's voice. But the tone was entirely wrong. There was no tremor, no fear, no softness. It was a command, cold, absolute, and utterly devoid of mercy. I froze, turning my head slightly. Harper stood up from behind the dumpster. She brushed the dirt off the knees of her tailored jeans. She casually shrugged off my heavy leather jacket, letting it drop to the wet pavement. The man with the rifle, Marcus, visibly flinched. He didn't fire. He lowered the barrel of his weapon toward the ground. "Miss Rossi," Marcus said. His voice actually shook. The other 3 men simultaneously lowered their weapons. They took a collective step back, adopting a posture of submission. I stared at Harper, my brain struggling to process the scene. Rossi. The Rossi crime syndicate. They controlled the ports on the East Coast and ran half the illegal gambling in Chicago. I had done a security audit for a federal prosecutor who was targeting them last year. Harper walked slowly past me. She didn't look at my bleeding face. She walked straight toward the 4 armed men. The scent of vanilla was gone. It was entirely gone. Instead, the air grew thick with a suffocating, terrifying pheromone. It was dark, sharp, and metallic, like ozone right before a lightning strike. It was the scent of an apex predator asserting dominance. My alpha instincts recoiled in pure confusion. Omegas didn't smell like that. Omegas didn't suppress alphas with their presence. "I told my father," Harper said calmly, stopping 5 feet from the heavily armed men. "I told him that I needed a few months of quiet." She reached out and adjusted the collar of Lurkus's tactical vest. Marcus stood rigidly at attention, his eyes fixed firmly on the ground. "I told him," she continued, her voice dangerously soft, "that if he sent his dogs to monitor me, I would skin them alive." "Boss's orders, miss," Marcus choked out. "He was worried about your safety. He wanted us to bring you home." Harper sighed. It sounded like genuine disappointment. "And your brilliant plan was to run my girlfriend's truck off the road and corner us in an alley." "We didn't know she was a fighter," Marcus mumbled. "She took out 2 of our spotters before we even drew our weapons." Harper finally turned her head and looked at me. The sweet, doe-eyed botanist from the conservatory was nowhere to be found. Her dark eyes were cold, calculating, and ancient. She looked at my bloody lip, my ruined shirt, and the awkward angle of my left arm. A muscle twitched in her jaw. "You hurt her," Harper stated. It wasn't a question. It was a death sentence. "Miss Rossi, please," Marcus started to say, taking a step backward. Harper moved faster than my eyes could track. She didn't use a weapon. She just stepped into Marcus's guard, grabbed the strap of his rifle, and drove her nose upward with shattering force. There was a sickening crunch of bone. Marcus dropped to the ground, gagging and clutching his ruined face. The other 3 men didn't move a muscle. They just stood there, letting their comrade bleed on the pavement. Harper stood over Marcus, her chest rising and falling rhythmically. She looked completely undisturbed by the violence. She looked bored. "Clean this up," Harper ordered the remaining 3 men. "Tell my father I am handling my own security from now on." "Yes, miss," the 3 men answered in unison. "And if any of you ever point a gun at her again," Harper added, gesturing toward me without looking, "I will burn your families." She turned around and walked back to me. The rain was starting to come down harder now. I stood there, gripping my combat knife, feeling completely useless. The world was spinning. Harper stopped in front of me. The terrifying metallic scent vanished, replaced instantly to the soft smell of vanilla and rain. Her face softened. The coldness in her eyes melted away, replaced by deep, genuine concern. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Sloane," she whispered saucily, "you're bleeding." I took a step back. I pointed the tip of my bloody knife directly at her chest. "Who the hell are you?" I asked. My voice was shaking. Not from the cold, and not from the pain. I was shaking because the woman I loved was a stranger. Harper looked at the knife, then up at my eyes. She didn't look angry. She looked incredibly sad. "I'm your Omega," she said quietly. "No, you're not," I replied, coughing up another drop of blood. "Omegas don't break faces. I am whatever I need to be to keep you alive, Sloane." She ignored the knife. She stepped right past the blade, pressing her body against mine. She wrapped her arms around my waist, being careful of my broken ribs. She buried her face in my neck, right over my scent gland. "I'm so sorry I lied to you," she murmured against my skin. "But we have to go now. My father knows where we are." I should have pushed her away. I should have walked out of the alley and never looked back. But my knees finally gave out. The adrenaline crashed, leaving only pain and exhaustion. Harper caught my weight effortlessly. For a botanist, she was terrifyingly strong. "I've got you," she whispered, half carrying me toward the street. "I'm going to take care of you, Sloane, I promise." I looked over my shoulder one last time. The 3 gunmen were quietly dragging Marcus's unconscious body toward a black van. I looked back at the woman holding me up. My Omega girlfriend. The Mafia boss's daughter. We stepped out of the alley and into the neon glare of Lake Street. I closed my eyes. The nightmare hadn't just ended. It was just beginning. Consciousness returned in jagged, painful fragments. The first thing I registered was the smell. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood or the damp grime of the Chicago Valley. It was clinical, expensive antiseptics mixed with rich mahogany and faint vanilla. I opened my eyes, fighting against the heavy pull of painkillers. The ceiling above me was pristine, vaulted, and adorned with subtle crown molding. I tried to sit up, but a sharp agony tore through my left side. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. "Don't move." The voice came from the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was Harper. She stepped into the dim light of the bedroom. She was no longer wearing the muddy jeans and ruined sweater from last night. She wore a crisp white silk shirt and tailored black slacks. She looked like a CEO. She looked like a mob boss. 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and a minor concussion, Harper recited calmly. She walked toward the edge of the king-sized bed. "My private surgeon put your shoulder back in place while you were unconscious. You need rest." I stared at her, my tactical mind desperately trying to assess the threat. "Where are we?" I rasped, my throat completely dry. "A secure penthouse in the Gold Coast," she replied, pouring water into a crystal glass. "It's off the books, under a shell corporation." She sat on the edge of the mattress and offered me the glass. I didn't take it. I forced myself to sit up, ignoring the burning pain in my chest. I swung my legs over the opposite side of the bed, planting my bare feet on the hardwood floor. I realized I was wearing nothing but my underwear and tight medical bandages. My alpha pride flared up, hot and defensive. "I don't need your doctor, and I don't need your safe house," I growled. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled immediately. Harker was there before I hit the floor. Her hands gripped my bare waist, her fingers cool and startlingly strong. "Stop being an idiot, Sloane," she snapped. There was no trace of the gentle botanist in her tone. This was an order. I looked down at her hands on my skin. "Take your hands off me, Rossi," I warned. I let out a low, rumbling growl from the back of my throat. It was a pure alpha warning, designed to make Omegas submit. Harper didn't even flinch. Instead, her grip tightened. She looked up at me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. The dominant, terrifying pheromones from the alley leaked into the room again. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. It suffocated my growl instantly. "Sit down," Harper said, her voice dropping an octave. My knees betrayed me. I sank back onto the edge of the mattress, breathing heavily. I felt humiliated. I was a highly trained contractor, an alpha who had survived war zones. Yet, I was being utterly dominated by an Omega in a silk shirt. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and betrayal. "The woman you've been sleeping next to for 6 months," she answered smoothly. She picked up the glass of water again and pressed it to my lips. "Drink." I was too thirsty to resist. I drank the cold water greedily, the liquid soothing my raw throat. Harper set the empty crystal glass on the polished nightstand. She didn't retreat to a safe distance. Instead, she picked up a damp, warm towel from a silver basin nearby. The water in the basin smelled faintly of iodine and lavender. "You have dried blood on your neck," she murmured. She moved closer, stepping smoothly between my parted knees. The sudden proximity made my heart slam violently against my broken ribs. I stiffened, every muscle in my body locking down in defense. She reached out and gently pressed the worn towel against my collarbone. Her touch was agonizingly slow, wiping away the grime of the alleyway. "You lied to me," I stated, staring straight ahead at the blank wall. "I omitted the truth," she corrected quietly, her focus entirely on my skin. "You acted like a civilian. You jumped at loud noises." Harper paused her wiping. She trailed the damp towel up the side of my neck, mapping the rigid line of my jaw. "I enjoyed being normal with you, Sloane. I enjoyed the illusion." Her thumb brushed lightly over my swollen lower lip. I hated how my treacherous body instantly reacted to her touch. My pulse quickened. The soft, familiar scent of vanilla started to weave through the heavy ozone of her dominance. "My father is Vincent Rossi," she said, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "He runs the Chicago syndicate, the ports, the unions, the underground casinos." She moved the towel down to my chest, carefully cleaning the unbandaged skin. "I am his only living heir." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "I wanted out," Harper continued, avoiding my gaze. "I wanted a quiet life, far away from the blood." "So you hid behind me," I accused her, my eyes finally meeting hers. "You used a private security contractor as a meat shield without telling her the payload?" Harper's dark eyes flashed with sudden anger. "I didn't use you," she said fiercely. She dropped the bloody towel into the silver basin with a sharp splash. She placed both hands flat against my bare chest, right over my pounding heart. Her skin was cool against my feverish body. "I fell in love with Lou." The confession hit me harder than the armored SUV had. I wanted to call her a liar, to push her away and barricade the door. But her heart rate was steady beneath my chest, and her scent shifted again. It became impossibly sweet, laced with a terrifying vulnerability. Alphas cannot lie about their scents, and neither can Omegas. It was the truth. "Your love got me 3 broken ribs and a target on my back," I said bitterly, gripping the bedsheets. "My father's men will never bother you again," Harper promised, her voice hardening. "What about your enemies, Harper?" I countered, my voice rising. "The ones who want to kidnap or kill the Rossi heir? The ones who don't follow your rules?" She leaned in closer, until her face was inches from mine. I could feel her warm breath ghosting over my lips. "That is exactly why you are staying here," she declared. "I protect what is mine." "I am not your property," I hissed, leaning forward into her space. The tension between us thickened, heavy enough to choke on. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was a dangerous, twisted sort of desire fueled by adrenaline and betrayal. We were two predators circling each other in a very expensive cage. "You belong to me, Sloane," she whispered, her gaze dropping deliberately to my lips. "Just as much as I belong to you." She closed the remaining fraction of an inch between us. Her lips brushed against mine. It wasn't a violent kiss, nor was it desperate. It was a terrifyingly soft, absolute claiming pressure. A violent shudder ran through my entire battered body. My alpha instincts warred violently with my tactical training. Logic screamed at me to run from the Mafia princess before I ended up in a body bag. My biology told me to pull her down onto the mattress and mark her as mine. I raised my good right hand and gripped her hip. I fully intended to push her away, but my traitorous fingers dug into the silk of her shirt, pulling her closer instead. Harper let out a soft, triumphant sigh against my mouth. She shifted her weight, pressing her thighs flush against the edge of the mattress. The kiss deepened, turning hungry and bruising. It tasted like danger, expensive mint, and absolute control. She tasted like everything I was trained to avoid. I broke the kiss abruptly, gasping for air. My ribs screamed in protest from the sudden movement. I rested my heavy forehead against her silk-clad shoulder. "This is madness," I muttered, my breath hot against her neck. "This is survival," Harper corrected gently, her fingers stroking the damp hair at the nape of my neck. "My father is old, Sloane. His grip is slipping." She pulled back just enough to force me to look into her eyes. "The families in New York smell blood in the water. They are moving in." I closed my eyes, the grim reality of the tactical situation washing over me. I wasn't just dating a liar. I was sleeping with the catalyst of a full-scale syndicate war. "And where do I fit into this war?" I asked, fatigue settling deep into my bones. Harper stood up slowly, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from her black slacks. The vulnerable, loving Omega disappeared completely. She was replaced once again by the cold, calculating mob heir. "You heal," she ordered, turning her back to me and walking toward the bedroom door. "And then, you stand by my side." She paused at the doorway, looking back at me over her shoulder. The dim light caught the sharp angle of her jaw. "Because when the shooting starts, Sloane, you are the only person in this city I trust not to put a bullet in my back." She stepped out into the hallway. She closed the heavy mahogany door behind her with a definitive thud. A second later, I heard the electronic deadbolt slide into place. The lock clicked loudly in the silent penthouse. I was perfectly safe, and I was completely trapped. The electronic cluck of the deadbolt echoed in my mind for 3 long days. The Gold Coast penthouse was a spectacular gilded cage. It featured floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass that overlooked the churning gray waters of Lake Michigan. It boasted a kitchen fully stocked with organic groceries, imported wines, and expensive espresso. But it also had reinforced steel doors and an independent, off-grid ventilation system. I spent the first 48 hours pacing the hardwood floors like a trapped, angry wolf. My tactical training demanded that I systematically find an exit, a blind spot, or a structural weakness. There were absolutely none. Whoever designed this safe house knew exactly how Tier 1 operatives like me thought. I was strictly confined to the master suite, the adjoining marble bathroom, and the massive living room. Harper came and went like a beautifully dressed ghost. She would unlock the door briefly, bringing with her the scent of rain, expensive perfume, and latent violence. She never once apologized for locking me in. She simply stated it was standard operational protocol for high-value assets during an active gang war. Calling me a high-value asset felt like a stinging slap in the face. But arguing with my ribs heavily taped and my shoulder burning was a losing battle. On the fourth night, a violent thunderstorm finally rolled in from the lake. Jagged forks of lightning illuminated the sleek, modernist furniture scattered across the living room. I was sitting on the edge of the leather sofa, slowly clooning a disassembled Glock 19. Harper had left the weapon on the glass coffee table that morning without a single word. It was a calculated peace offering, or perhaps a psychological test. Knowing her, it was probably both. The heavy mahogany door unlocked with a soft, mechanical whir. Harper walked into the dim room. She was completely soaked, her black designer trench coat dripping water onto the imported Persian rug. Her face was pale in the lightning flashes, and her dark eyes looked hollow with exhaustion. She didn't look at me. She walked straight to the illuminated wet bars and poured a generous measure of neat bourbon. She tossed the amber liquid back in one smooth, practiced swallow. The metallic smell of blood clung faintly to her wet coat. I knew instantly it wasn't her blood. My alpha instincts flared up immediately, feeling protective and intensely aggressive all at once. "You're trunking mud in your very expensive cage," I said quietly. I slotted the slide onto the frame of the Glock and racked it back firmly. The sharp, oiled, metallic clack made her turn her head. Harper leaned back against the marble counter, watching me intently. "The Moretti family finally made their move tonight," she said flatly. "They hit 2 of our main distribution warehouses in the South Side." She took off her soaked coat and dropped it carelessly onto a leather bar stool. Underneath, she wore a dark, tight turtleneck that hugged her curves flawlessly. "Any casualties?" I asked, setting the loaded gun down on the table. "6 of my father's most loyal men," she replied. Her voice was completely devoid of any normal human emotion. It was terrifying to witness how easily she wore the heavy mantle of a mob boss. "And the Moretti hitmen?" I pressed, leaning forward slightly. Harper walked slowly toward the sofa. She stopped right in front of me, looking down with cold, dark eyes. "There are none left breathing," she said. The sheer, casual ruthlessness in her tone sent a cold shiver down my spine. This was the exact same woman who used to cry during sad dog food commercials on television. She reached out and smoothly picked up the Glock from the coffee table. She checked the chamber and the safety with practiced, fluid ease. "You've been practicing your drills," I noted, my eyes narrowing defensively. "My father had me trained by ex-Mossad instructors when I was 12 years old," she answered. She calmly handed the gun back to me, presenting the grip first. "I just pretended to be terrified of loud noises so you would hold me tightly at the shooting range." I snatched the heavy gun from her pale hand. The burning anger from the alleyway was still there, simmering dangerously just below the surface. "Stop playing these twisted games with me, Harper," I growled. I stood up abruptly, deliberately ignoring the dull, throbbing ache in my ribs. I was taller than her by several inches, built with the lean muscle of a soldier. I used my physical height to loom over her, projecting my alpha pheromones aggressively into the room. It was a direct, biological challenge. I wanted to see the soft Omega beneath the impenetrable Mafia armor. I wanted to see her yield to me, even if just for a single second. The air between us practically crackled with unseen electricity. My scent was dark pine and wood smoke, heavy and thick with territorial dominance. Harper didn't back down an inch. She tilted her chin up proudly, meeting my aggressive stare perfectly. Her scent shifted in response, but it didn't turn sweet or submissive as nature intended. The comforting vanilla vanished entirely. The suffocating metallic ozone returned, sharp and terrifyingly electric. She was biologically an Omega, but her sheer, terrifying willpower was overriding her own biology. "I am not playing a game, Sloane," she whispered, her voice dark and dangerous. She stepped closer, invading my personal space entirely without hesitation. Her chest brushed lightly against mine. I am fighting a brutal war on two separate fronts. She reached up and grabbed the collar of my plain black t-shirt. Her grip was surprisingly tight, her knuckles turning white. I am fighting the New York families in the bloody streets of Chicago. She pulled me down slightly, forcing me to bend my neck to maintain eye contact. And I am fighting my own stubborn alpha in my bedroom. My breath caught painfully in my dry throat. The possessive word "my" echoed loudly in the quiet room. I grabbed her wrist quickly, fully intending to pry her fingers off my shirt. But her skin was burning hot, and my pulse spiked dramatically the moment I touched her. Instead of pushing her away, my thumb instinctively found her racing pulse point. It was fluttering wildly beneath her soft skin. She wasn't nearly as calm and collected as she pretended to be. "You locked me in a room," I reminded her roughly, my voice a low rumble. "I kept you breathing," she countered instantly, her lips hovering merely an inch from my jaw. "If you walk out that heavy steel door, Moretti's hitmen will gun you down in the lobby." "They can certainly try," I scoffed, my professional pride stinging deeply. "They won't miss a second time," she said softly, her eyes tracing my features. Her free hand drifted slowly up my chest, tracing the outline of my thick bandages. The touch was agonizingly gentle against my badly bruised ribs. It was a stark, dizzying contrast to the brutal violence we were actively discussing. "I need to change your dressings," she murmured. The sudden domestic shift in topic threw me completely off balance. She was an absolute master at this psychological warfare. She kept me perpetually off kilter, constantly shifting between ruthless syndicate boss and caring, devoted mate. "I can do it myself," I muttered stubbornly, tightening my grip on her wrist. "Sit down, Sloane," she commanded. It wasn't a gentle request. The ozone sense spiked sharply in the air, pressing heavily against my highly tuned senses. I hated myself for yielding, but I slowly sat back down on the leather sofa. Harper walked into the adjoining bathroom and quickly returned with a white medical kit. She knelt down gracefully on the Persian rug, right between my spread legs. The physical position was deeply intimate and wildly, intoxicatingly dangerous. She unbuttoned her cuffs calmly and rolled up her sleeves. Her forearms were pale, smooth, and completely flawless. She reached firmly for the bottom of my t-shirt. "Lift your arms," she instructed. I pulled the dark shirt over my head, wincing slightly as my stiff shoulder protested the movement. I dropped the discarded shirt onto the floor beside the coffee table. Harper carefully began snipping away the old, blood-spotted bandages with sharp medical shears. Her focus was intense and unwavering, her dark hair falling forward to frame her beautiful face. I watched her delicate hands work. These were the exact same hands that had coldly ordered multiple executions tonight. These were also the exact same hands that patiently baked sourdough bread for me on lazy Sunday mornings. My brain simply couldn't reconcile the two conflicting images. "Why didn't you just tell me the truth from the start?" I asked, my voice softer now. The thunderstorm raged loudly outside, rattling the thick, bulletproof glass windows. Harper gently peeled the surgical tape away from my sensitive skin. She didn't look up from her task. "Because if you knew I was a Rossi, you would have treated me strictly like a high-risk target." She applied a shockingly cold antiseptic wipe directly to the bruised, broken skin. I hissed sharply through my teeth. "I would have treated you like a professional client," I corrected her firmly. "Exactly," she said, finally looking up to me, my eyes. Her dark eyes were suddenly wide and incredibly vulnerable. "I didn't want to be your temporary client. I wanted to be your permanent partner." She placed a fresh white gauze pad carefully over the worst of the purple bruising. She began wrapping the new elastic bandage tightly around my muscular torso. To do it properly, She had to lean in incredibly close, wrapping her arms completely around my back. Her soft face pressed directly against my bare, hard stomach. The sweet scent of vanilla suddenly flooded my senses, completely masking the harsh ozone. It was a deliberate, calculated biological surrender. She was intentionally showing me her underbelly, letting the true Omega out from behind the walls. My hands twitched violently on the leather cushions. I desperately wanted to bury my fingers deep in her hair, to hold her fiercely against me. I gritted my teeth hard and kept my hands flat and unmoving on the sofa. "You have a very strange way of showing a romantic partnership, locking me up in a vault," I said rigidly. Harper finished taping the tight bandage and slowly leaned back. She rested her hands lightly on my bare thighs, her thumbs stroking my skin. "The lockdown officially ends tonight," she announced quietly. My eyes snapped down to hers, searching for the catch. Why the sudden change? "Because my father suffered a massive stroke 2 hours ago," she said. The heavy words dropped like a lead weight in the quiet, dimly lit room. "He is currently on life support at a private, heavily guarded clinic." I sat up straighter, forcefully ignoring the sharp pain radiating from my ribs. The fearsome head of the Chicago syndicate was effectively incapacitated. The power vacuum in criminal underworld would be absolutely catastrophic. "The Moretti family will know by tomorrow morning," I stated, my tactical brain instantly analyzing the threat. "They already know," Harper corrected, her soft voice turning ice cold again. "They paid off one of his trusted night nurses." She stood up slowly, picking up the white medical kit from the floor. "Tomorrow morning, the entire city goes to open war." She looked down at me, her beautiful expression completely unreadable. "I need my alpha, Sloane." It wasn't a mob boss's command this time. It was a desperate, genuine plea. It was the most honest, unfiltered thing she had said to me in 6 entire months. "I need you to help me take ruthless control of the Rossi family." I looked at the black Glock sitting innocently on the glass coffee table. Then I looked up at the stunning woman I loved, the undisputed heir to a bloody criminal empire. I was a highly trained private security contractor. My sole job was to protect innocent people from dangerous monsters. Now I was being openly asked to help a beautiful monster take her bloody throne. "If I agree to do this," I said slowly, meeting her unwavering gaze, "we do it strictly my way, tactical, clean, and with absolute minimal civilian casualties." Harper smiled in the dim light. It was a terrifying, breathtakingly beautiful smile. "You have a deal," she whispered. She leaned down gracefully and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the corner of my scarred mouth. "Get some sleep tonight, Sloane." She turned elegantly and walked toward the bedroom door. "We have a massive city to burn to the ground tomorrow." Dawn broke over the Chicago skyline like a bruised eye. The violent storm had passed, leaving the city streets slick and gray. I stood in the expansive master bathroom, taping my ribs with rigid precision. The pain was a sharp, grounding reminder of my reality. I pulled a lightweight Kevlar vest over my tight black t-shirt. It concealed perfectly beneath my tailored leather jacket. I chopped the action on my Glock 19. I loaded a magazine of hollow point rounds and holstered it at my hip. I slipped a backup combat knife into my right boot. Harper watched me from the bedroom doorway. She was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray designer suit. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless knot. She didn't look like a soft Omega holding onto her dying father's empire. She looked like an executioner. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice completely devoid of emotion. I nodded once, securing the retaining strap on my tactical holster. "Where is the meeting?" I asked, walking past her into the living room. "Fulton Market District," she replied, heading straight for the heavy front door. a meatpacking plant my family has owned since the early 80s. We took a private, encrypted elevator down to the underground parking garage. A black armored Cadillac Escalade was waiting with its engine idling. Two large men in dark suits stood rigidly by the rear doors. They both wheezed slightly when they saw me walking closely behind Harper. My alpha pheromones were dialed up, thick with territorial warning. I wasn't hiding my violent intent. Anyone who touched her today was going to die. Harper slid gracefully into the back seat. I got in right beside her, keeping my right hand resting near my weapon. The drive through the early morning city was entirely silent. I watched the empty streets, tracking every passing delivery truck and parked car. Harper stared straight ahead, her face an unreadable, beautiful mask. The Cadillac pulled into a discreet loading bay behind a massive brick building. The heavy steel doors rolled shut behind us instantly. The air inside smelled intensely of raw meat, ammonia, and freezing temperatures. "Stay close," Harper murmured, as we stepped out onto the concrete floor. "Always," I replied softly, falling into step half a pace behind her right shoulder. 4 more heavily armed guards escorted us through a maze of hanging beef carcasses. The ambient temperature dropped sharply as we walked deeper inside. We finally reached a heavy set of double steel doors. 2 men stood guard outside, their hands resting on submachine guns. They opened the heavy doors without saying a single word. We stepped into a large, windowless concrete room that had been cleared of machinery. A long, freezing metal table sat directly in the center. 5 men sat around it. These were the capos, the brutal underbosses who controlled the city's illegal arteries. They were all hardened criminals, survivors of decades of bloody gang warfare. And they were all alphas. The air in the enclosed room was instantly suffocating. 5 distinct alpha scents clashed aggressively, creating a toxic atmosphere of dominance. When Harper walked in, the low conversation stopped dead. None of the men stood up to greet her. It was a blatant, calculated show of extreme disrespect. I felt my jaw clench hard. I stepped forward slightly, fully ready to force them to their feet by the throat. Harper raised a single finger, stopping me instantly in my tracks. She walked calmly to the head of the long metal table. She remained standing, looking down at the seated men. "Gentlemen," Harper said. Her voice was clear and cold, cutting through the heavy, hostile air. "My father suffered a severe stroke last night." A quiet murmur rippled through the seated men. "I am assuming direct control of all family operations, effective immediately." A man sitting to her immediate left let out a harsh, barking laugh. His name was Dominic. He ran the port smuggling operations and had a reputation for extreme brutality. He was a massive man with a thick neck and a face scarred from old knife fights. "With all due respect, Miss Rossi," Dominic sneered, leaning back in his metal chair, "you are an Omega." He spat the word onto the floor like a dirty insult. "You bake cookies and arrange flowers. This is a war council." He gestured dismissively toward the heavy steel doors. "Go back to your greenhouse. Let the men handle the Moretti family." The other 4 capos nodded in silent, grim agreement. The aggression in their combined pheromones spiked drastically. They were actively trying to force her into biological submission. As an alpha, the combined pressure made my skin crawl with the desperate urge to fight. I dropped my right hand casually to the grip of my Glock. I calculated the draw speed in my head. I could put 3 of them down before they even cleared their shoulder holsters. But Harper didn't need my gun to control the room. She placed both her bare hands flat on the freezing metal table. She didn't raise her voice or draw a weapon. She simply stopped suppressing her own scent. The sweet vanilla didn't just vanish, it was violently eradicated. The dark, metallic ozone flooded the concrete room like a massive tidal wave. It was impossibly dense, sharp as shattered glass in the lungs. It smelled like copper wire burning in a violent rainstorm. It hit my senses so hard, my vision actually blurred for a fraction of a second. The 5 massive capos physically recoiled in their chairs. Dominic gripped the edge of the table, his scarred face draining of color entirely. Alphas are hardwired by nature to dominate omegas. But an apex predator is an apex predator regardless of their biological designation. Harper's presence was terrifying, ancient, and completely absolute. "I am not asking for your permission, Dominic," Harper whispered. The room was dead silent. Even the low hum of the industrial refrigeration unit seemed to fade away. Dominic gritted his teeth, his alpha pride fighting a losing battle against sheer terror. "Your father promised me the South Side territory," Dominic choked out, refusing to look away. "I won't take orders from a little girl playing dress-up." He made a fatal, irreversible mistake. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket for his weapon. My gun was out of its holster and leveled at his head in less than a second. "Hands on the table," I barked, my voice echoing loudly off the concrete. Dominic froze instantly, staring down the black barrel of my Glock. Harper didn't even flinch at my sudden movement. She slowly walked around the metal table toward Dominic's chair. "I know about the money you've been skimming from the docks, Dominic," she said casually. Dominic's eyes widened in sheer panic. "I also know you met secretly with the Moretti underboss 3 days ago." The other 4 capos shifted their chairs away from Dominic instantly. Treason during a syndicate war was an immediate death sentence. "It's a lie!" Dominic stammered heavily, cold sweat beading on his forehead. Harper stopped right beside his chair. She reached into the inner pocket of her own suit jacket. She didn't pull out a gun. She pulled out a small, heavy silver ledger. She dropped it onto the metal table right in front of his face. It landed with a loud, final thud. "Account numbers, transfer dates, and recorded wiretaps," Harper stated flatly. Dominic stared at the ledger like it was a highly venomous snake. He realized immediately that he was a dead man. With a sudden, desperate roar, Dominic lunged upward out of his metal chair. He didn't go for his gun. He went straight for Harper's pale throat. He intended to use his massive body weight to snap her neck before I could shoot. I squeezed the trigger without hesitation. The loud gunshot was absolutely deafening inside the concrete room. Dominic screamed loudly as his right kneecap shattered completely. He collapsed onto the freezing floor, clutching his ruined leg in agony. Dark blood cooled quickly on the gray concrete. I kept my weapon trained firmly on the other 4 capos. None of them moved a single muscle. They stared at Harper with wide, utterly terrified eyes. Harper looked down at Dominic writing on the floor. She didn't look shocked by the blood or the sudden violence. She looked incredibly bored. She bent down smoothly and picked up the silver ledger from the table. "You have a choice, gentlemen," Harper said softly, turning back to the remaining men. "You can fall in line right now." She stepped carefully over Dominic's bleeding body. "Or you can bleed out on a meatpacking floor." The 4 men looked at each other nervously. Then, as if perfectly synchronized, they all slowly stood up. They didn't reach anywhere near their weapons. They lowered their heads respectfully and offered their wrists, a universal sign of syndicate submission. "We are with you, boss," the oldest capo said, his voice shaking slightly. Harper nodded once, accepting their surrender. "Clean up this mess," she ordered, gesturing lazily toward Dominic. and get me the exact coordinates of the Moretti safe houses." She turned around and walked calmly back toward the heavy steel doors. I kept my gun raised until she was completely clear of the room. Then I holstered my weapon and followed her out into the freezing hallway. The heavy doors closed behind us, completely muffling Dominic's pathetic groans. We walked back through the hanging carcasses in absolute silence. My heart was hammering violently against my bruised ribs. I had just executed a tactical strike for a mob boss. I had crossed a heavy line I could never uncross. We reached the black Cadillac. Before we got in, Harper stopped and turned to face me. The suffocating ozone scent faded away instantly. The soft, familiar vanilla returned, washing over me like a warm, safe breeze. She reached out and gently straightened the collar of my leather jacket. "That was a very clean shot, Sloane," she murmured softly. She looked up at me, her dark eyes filled with genuine, terrifying affection. "Thank you for watching my back." I looked down at her, feeling completely trapped by my own treacherous heart. She was a ruthless monster who smelled exactly like my favorite memory. "No civilian casualties," I reminded her rigidly, my voice tight. "That was our deal." Harper smiled softly and brushed a cool thumb across my cheekbone. "Dominic wasn't a civilian," she whispered. She opened the heavy car door and slid into the back seat. I stood alone in the freezing garage for a brief moment. I realized I wasn't just her hired protection anymore. I was her alpha. And I was going to help her burn this entire city to the ground. 72 hours. That was how long the war had been burning across Chicago. The Gold Coast penthouse no longer felt like a gilded cage. It felt like a military bunker. The expensive Persian rugs were rolled up and shoved into corners. The glass coffee table was completely covered with digital tablets and city blueprints. A heavy haze of stale coffee, expensive tobacco, and nervous sweat hung in the air. 3 of Harper's newly loyal capos were huddled around the table. I stood near the reinforced windows, watching the traffic crawl along Lakeshore Drive. My bruised ribs still ached, but the painkillers kept my mind incredibly sharp. I was officially the Rossi family's primary tactical advisor. I directed their hitters with the same cold precision I used in overseas combat zones. The Moretti stash house in River North is fully fortified, an older capo named Sal muttered. He pointed a thick finger at a highlighted building on the digital map. "They have reinforced steel plates on the ground floor windows. We need explosives." "No explosives," I interjected smoothly, not turning away from the window. The room went completely silent. The capos didn't like me, but they feared my gun and my proximity to their boss. I turned around and walked slowly toward the glass table. "River North is too densely populated. You will cause mass civilian casualties." I leaned over the digital blueprint, tracing a blue line with my finger. "You cut the main fiber optic line in the alleyway at exactly 2:00 a.m. I looked up, making direct eye contact with Sal. "When their security cameras go blind, you breach through the adjoining roof using thermal cutters." Sal frowned, his thick brow furrowing in concentration. "It's quiet. It's surgical," I finished firmly. "And no innocent people catch stray bullets." Harper sat at the head of the table in a sleek black turtleneck. She hadn't slept in 3 days. Her posture was still terrifyingly perfect, her spine straight as a steel rod. The suffocating metallic ozone of her dominance filled every corner of the room. She kept the alpha capos completely suppressed through sheer biological force. "We do it Sloane's way," Harper ordered, her voice raspy but absolute. "Execute the breach tonight. Leave no survivors inside the perimeter." "Yes, boss," Sal replied instantly, lowering his eyes in submission. The three men quickly gathered their secure phones and filed out of the penthouse. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, locking automatically. The sudden silence in the massive room was deafening. I stayed by the table, watching the digital maps flicker on the screens. I heard a soft, shuddering breath behind me. I turned my head. Harper was still sitting in the high-backed leather chair, but the terrifying mob boss illusion was rapidly fracturing. She leaned forward, burying her face in both of her hands. The rigid perfection of her posture finally collapsed. The sharp, suffocating smell of ozone in the air wavered. It smelled burnt, tired, and deeply fragile. I walked around the glass table, my heavy boots silent on the hardwood floor. I stopped right behind her chair. I didn't say a word. I just reached down and placed both of my hands on her tense shoulders. Her muscles were knotted as tight as piano wire. She flinched slightly at the initial contact. Then, she let out a long, exhausted sigh and leaned her head back against my stomach. "You're burning yourself out," I murmured softly. My voice was a low, comforting rumble in the quiet room. "If I show weakness for even a second, they will slit my throat," Harper whispered. She didn't open her eyes. Dominic was just the first. There are wolves everywhere in the city. I shifted my stance, pressing my body closer to the back of her chair. I slowly released my own alpha pheromones. I didn't project dominance or aggression this time. I projected pure, unadulterated safety. The scent of deep pine forests and warm wood smoke washed over her completely. It was a biological blanket designed entirely to shield and soothe an Omega. Harper gasped softly. Her hands dropped from her face, resting limply in her lap. The terrifying metallic smell in the room vanished completely. It was instantly replaced by the overwhelming, sweet scent of warm vanilla and petrichor. It was the scent of the woman I fell in love with at the conservatory. "Let the wolves come," I said quietly, my thumbs massaging the tight muscles in her neck. "They have to get through me first." Harper reached up and covered my right hand with her own. Her skin was startlingly cold. "You promised me a quiet life, Sloane," she murmured, a bitter edge to her voice. "I promised to keep you safe," I corrected her gently. I slid my hands down her arms, pulling her up from the heavy leather chair. She stood up willingly, turning around to face me. She looked impossibly fragile in the dim lighting of the penthouse. Dark circles bruised the skin under her beautiful eyes. "I have ordered the deaths of 20 men in the last 3 days," Harper said. She looked down at her own pale, flawless hands. "I am covered in blood, Sloane, even if you can't see it." I reached out and gently tilted her chin up. I forced her to look into my eyes. "I knew exactly who you were the moment you birthed the hitman's face in the alley," I said. I brushed a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear. "I am not afraid of your darkness, Harper." Her breath hitched noticeably. The vanilla scent spiked, thickening with a sudden, heavy wave of desire. "You should be," she whispered, her gaze dropping to my lips. "I am incredibly selfish. I will never let you go now." "I never asked you to," I replied. I closed the small distance between us, wrapping my arms fully around her waist. I pulled her flush against my chest, being careful of my tilped ribs. Harper melted against me instantly. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, right over my scent gland. She took a deep, shuddering breath, breathing in my alpha scent like pure oxygen. Her hands gripped the back of my leather jacket tightly. She was an incredibly powerful mob boss,
holding the entire Chicago underworld by the throat. But right now, in Nan's arms, she was just a tired Omega seeking refuge. I rested my chin on the top of her head. I slowly stroked her back, feeling the tense line of her spine relax entirely. "Sleep, Harper," I commanded softly. It was an alpha directive, laced with heavy pheromones. "Just for a few hours. I have the watch. Stay with me," she murmured, her voice already slurring with exhaustion. "Always," I promised. I didn't let her go. I simply picked her up. She weighed almost nothing in my arms. I carried her out of the makeshift war room and into the dark master bedroom. I laid her down gently on the massive, king-sized mattress. I didn't bother turning on the expensive bedside lamps. The ambient light from the city skyline outside the windows was enough. I took off my boots and my tactical holster, placing the loaded Glock on the nightstand. I kept my Kevlar vest and my dark clothes on. I climbed onto the mattress and lay down beside her.
Harper immediately crawled across the expensive sheets. She pressed her body firmly against my side, throwing one arm across my chest. She tucked her face under my jaw, hiding entirely from the world. The sheer trust in her movement made my heart ache violently. She trusted me with her life, her empire, and her fragile, hidden heart. I wrapped my right arm around her shoulders, pulling her even closer. The heavy rain started to fall outside again, hitting the bulletproof glass. I stared at the ceiling, listening to her breathing slowly even out. The war with the Moretti family was far from over. Tomorrow, there would be more blood, more strategy, and more death. I would have to become a ruthless killer to keep her safe on her bloody throne. But in this quiet, dark room, none of that mattered. I kissed the top of her dark hair. She was my Omega. She was my dangerous, beautiful, terrifying Mafia queen. And I would burn the entire world to ash before I let anyone hurt her again. The River North raid was executed with terrifying perfection. Not a single civilian was harmed. Not a single Moretti soldier survived to tell the tale. The surgical brutality of the strike sent a massive shockwave through the Chicago underworld. It proved that the Rossi family was not bleeding out. It proved that the new boss was a calculating nightmare. 3 days later, Harper decided it was time to show her face to the public. The annual Mayor's Charity Gala was being held at the Lyric Opera of Chicago. It was a mandated neutral ground where high society freely mingled with high-level organized crime. Attendance was absolutely mandatory for a syndicate boss claiming the throne. I stood in the center of the massive walk-in closet, adjusting my cuffs. I was wearing a custom-tailored midnight black tuxedo. It was cut perfectly to hide the bulk of my Kevlar vest and the shoulder holster carrying my Glock 19. I looked like a high-end bodyguard. I felt like an executioner attending a royal ball. Harper walked out from behind the frosted glass divider. My breath caught sharply in my throat. She wore a floor-length backless gown made of dark emerald silk. The fabric clung to her curves like liquid glass. Her dark hair was swept up into an intricate, elegant style, exposing the pale column of her neck. She looked breathtakingly beautiful. She also looked completely untouchable. "You clean up well, Sloane," she murmured, her dark eyes scanning my tailored suit. "I prefer tactical gear," I replied, my voice slightly thicker than usual. She walked toward me, the silk of her gown whispering against the hardwood floor. She stopped barely an inch away, her familiar scent of vanilla weaving around me. She handed me a small, matte black Sig Sauer P238. It was a compact, lethal little weapon designed specifically for deep concealment. "Put it on me," she ordered softly. She turned her back to me and lifted the heavy slit of her emerald gown. She exposed her bare, flawless left thigh. A black elastic tactical garter was already strapped high up on her leg. My mouth went completely dry. My tactical brain short-circuited for a dangerous fraction of a second. I took the cold metal weapon from her hand. I knelt down slowly on one knee, right at her feet. My knuckles brushed against the warm, impedibly soft skin of her thigh. Harper let out a quiet, trembling sigh above me. I slipped the compact pistol carefully into the elastic holster. I made sure the safety was engaged and the grip was easily accessible. I lingered for a second, my thumb resting lightly against the smooth skin just above the holster. The heavy metallic ozone of her dominance was completely gone. Only the sweet, intoxicating scent of an Omega completely yielding to her alpha remained. "If anyone makes you reach for this tonight," I whispered, looking up at her, "I will personally burn the opera house to the ground." Harper looked down at me, a dangerous, beautiful smile playing in her red lips. "I know you will," she replied. She let the silk fabric drop, completely concealing the lethal weapon. "Let's go breed the wolves." The drive down Wacker Drive was tense and completely silent. The armored Cadillac pulled up to the grand entrance of the Lyric Opera. Flashbulbs exploded violently into the night as the city's elite exited their vehicles. I stepped out first, scanning the crowd, the rooftops, and the valets with brutal efficiency. The perimeter was temporarily clear. I offered my right hand to Harper. She placed her gloved hand in mine and stepped gracefully out of the heavy SUV. The paparazzi went absolutely wild. She was the beautiful, tragic heir to the Rossi Empire, making her first public appearance since her father's stroke. She ignored the flashing cameras completely. She walked up the grand staircase with her chin held high. I stayed exactly half a pace behind her right shoulder. My eyes constantly darted through the crowd, profiling every single person we passed. We entered the massive, gold-leafed lobby of the opera house. The air was instantly thick with expensive perfumes, aged scotch, and heavy alpha pheromones. The criminal elite of Chicago were heavily congregated near the brass bars. The moment Harper stepped into the grand hall, the ambient noise dropped noticeably. Eyes turned toward her, calculating and utterly predatory. We didn't make it 10 feet before the crowd parted intentionally. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a silver suit blocked our path. Enzo Moretti, the younger brother of the Moretti boss and their most vicious enforcer. He smelled overwhelmingly of rotting citrus and cheap arrogance. He was an alpha who thoroughly enjoyed hurting people. "Miss Rossi," Enzo sneered, spreading his arms wide in mock greeting. He didn't bow his head. He didn't offer his wrist. He stepped directly into her personal space, violating every rule of syndicate etiquette. "I was shocked to see you on the guest list." Harper didn't step back. Her face remained a beautiful, frozen mask of absolute indifference. "The opera is a Rossi tradition, Enzo," she said smoothly. "I am surprised you can appreciate the culture. I thought your family preferred hiding in warehouses." It was a direct, surgical verbal strike regarding the River North massacre. Enzo's face flushed dark red with sudden, violent anger. He dropped all pretense of high society politeness. He forcefully projected his alpha pheromones directly at Harper. It was a biological assault designed to make an Omega publicly submit and lower her eyes. I saw Harper's slender jaw tighten slightly against the suffocating pressure. That was enough for me. I didn't reach for my hidden Glock. Firing a weapon at a mayoral gala was tactical suicide. Instead, I stepped smoothly between Harper and Enzo. I used my physical size to completely cut off his line of sight to my Omega. I looked dead into his dark, furious eyes. Then, I unleashed my own alpha presence. I didn't just project dominance, I projected absolute, lethal violence. The scent of dark pine and wood smoke violently crashed into the lobby. It obliterated Enzo's rotting citrus scent instantly. My pheromones were heavy, ancient, and thick with territorial bloodlust. I forced all of that biological pressure directly down onto Enzo's shoulders. He physically staggered backward, his silver suit jacket wrinkling. The sheer force of my scent made his eyes widen in genuine primal terror. He was a street thug pretending to be an apex predator. I was a trained killer who had hunted actual monsters. "Take exactly 3 steps back," I commanded softly. My voice was a low, vibrating rumble that only he and Harper could hear. "Before I snap your neck and leave you in the coat check." Enzo swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly. His alpha pride desperately wanted him to throw a punch. But his biological instincts were screaming at him to run for his life. He looked at my cold, dead eyes and made the smart choice. He took 3 deliberate steps backward. "This isn't Oze," Enzo spat nervously, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. "Tell your brother the Rossi family sends their regards," Harper said from closely behind my back. Her voice was laced with that terrifying metallic ozone again. Enzo turned quickly and practically fled toward the other side of the grand lobby. The surrounding crowd of mobsters and socialites parted for him, murmuring in shocked whispers. They had just watched the Moretti enforcer publicly submit to the Rossi heir's bodyguard. The power dynamic in Chicago had just violently shifted in front of the entire city. I took a deep breath, slowly reeling my aggressive pheromones back in. I turned around to face Harper. She was looking up at me, her dark eyes entirely, completely blown out with desire. The public display of my extreme territorial protection had thoroughly affected her. "You are a very dangerous dog to keep off a leash, Sloane," she whispered. Her breathing was slightly uneven, her chest rising and falling against the emerald silk. "I don't wear a leash," I replied, offering her my arm again. "I know," she murmured softly, slipping her gloved hand through the crook of my elbow. "That is exactly why I chose you." We walked together toward the grand staircase leading to the private viewing boxes. The entire room watched us in absolute, terrified silence. The Ice Queen had fully claimed her bloody throne, and the entire city now knew she possessed a monster capable of defending it. The rest of the charity gala was a tedious blur of poisoned smiles and veiled threats. It smelled violently, overwhelmingly aroused. The sheer display of lethal alpha protection had triggered a deep biological response. We didn't speak a single word for the rest of the drive. The silence in the car was heavier than the gunfire had been. We reached the secure underground garage of the Gold Coast penthouse. The doors hadn't even fully closed before Harper grabbed my leather lapel. She pulled me out of the vehicle, her grip shockingly strong. We walked into the private elevator, completely ignoring the shaken security team. The elevator doors slid shut. Harper shoved me hard against the mirrored wall. She didn't hesitate. She crashed her lips against mine with desperate, bruising force. My tactical discipline shattered completely into a million pieces. I dropped my empty gun onto the metal floor of the elevator. I wrapped both arms tightly around her waist, lifting her off the ground. The kiss tasted like adrenaline, expensive champagne, and absolute claiming. She wrapped her long legs around my hips, not caring about the expensive silk dress. I backed her into the opposite corner, pressing her firmly against the cool glass. The elevator chimed quietly, opening into the dark, silent penthouse. I carried her blindly into the hallway, our mouths never breaking contact. I kicked the heavy bedroom door open and practically threw her onto the massive mattress. I followed her down instantly, trapping her beneath my weight. My alpha pheromones exploded into the room. The scent of dark pine and territorial aggression was suffocating. I wasn't trying to soothe her anymore. I was actively marking my territory. I pinned her wrists to the expensive sheets above her head. "You belong to me," I growled, my voice a rough, vibrating warning. "Tell me you belong to me." Harper arched her back, offering her throat completely to my gaze. The cold, terrifying mob boss was entirely gone. Only my desperate, devoted Omega remained. "I am yours, Sloane," she gasped, her eyes blazing with absolute surrender. "Only yours. Tear the world apart for me." I leaned down and buried my face in the crook of her neck. I inhaled the overwhelming scent of vanilla and rain. My teeth grazed the highly sensitive skin directly over her scent gland. She let out a high, broken sob that shattered my remaining self-control. I didn't bite down to complete the biological bond. Not yet. I wanted her to feel every single second of the burn. I released her wrists and trailed my hands down the sides of her emerald gown. I found the hidden zipper at the base of her spine. I pulled it down in one smooth, aggressive motion. The expensive silk parted, revealing her pale, flawless skin in the dim light. She reached up and grabbed the lapels of my tuxedo jacket. She pulled it off my shoulders with frantic, impatient hands. She didn't care about the heavy Kevlar vest or the shoulder holster. She just desperately wanted my skin against hers. I shed the tactical gear, letting it drop carelessly to the hardwood floor. We were a chaotic tangle of desperate limbs and suffocating pheromones. Every touch felt like a live electrical wire. She mapped the hard lines of my shoulders, tracing the old, faded combat scars. I traced the soft curve of her waist, mapping the dangerous woman I had sworn to protect. The contrast between us was absolute and entirely intoxicating. She was soft, calculating, and devastatingly lethal from the shadows. I was hardened, direct, and completely unapologetic in my violence. We were two halves of a very bloody, very perfect whole. I pressed my lips against her collarbone, trailing wet, burning kisses down her chest. Harper tangled her fingers violently in my short hair, holding me exactly where she wanted me. "Don't hold back," she whispered fiercely into the dark room. "Not tonight. Show me the monster." I looked up into her dark, demanding eyes. I stopped suppressing the darkest, most territorial parts of my alpha nature. I let the absolute obsession I felt for her take complete control. I kissed her again, devouring the soft gasp that escaped her lips. The outside world, the syndicate war, the looming threat of the Moretti family, it all ceased to exist. There was only the heat of her skin and the desperate rhythm of our breathing. We communicated in a silent language of arching backs and tightened grips. It was a slow, agonizingly beautiful descent into complete madness. Every caress was a tactical advance. Every kiss a deliberate surrender. I pushed her to the absolute edge of her endurance, refusing to let her fall. She practically begged me, her voice breaking into tiny, fractured pieces, but I made her wait. I made her understand exactly who held the power in this dark, silent room. When I finally let us cross the absolute point of no return, she screamed my name. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph and utter defeat. I followed her over the edge a second later, my vision going completely white. My heart slammed violently against my bruised ribs, trying to break out of my chest. We collapsed against each other, completely covered in a sheen of cold sweat. The heavy scent of our mingled pheromones was baked permanently into the sheets. Harper rested her head heavily on my bare chest, listening to my racing heartbeat. Her fingers lazily traced meaningless patterns over my collarbone. "We crossed the line," she murmured softly into the quiet darkness. "There is no going back now, Sloane." I wrapped my arms tightly around her, holding her securely against my body. I stared up at the vaulted ceiling of the gilded cage. I had broken every single professional rule I ever had. I had slept with my client, and I had joined a brutal criminal syndicate. But as I felt her soft breath against my skin, I knew I didn't care. "I'm not going anywhere," I promised, my voice a quiet rumble in the night. "We win this war, Harper, whatever it takes." She smiled against my skin, a terrifying, incredibly beautiful gesture. The Alpha had officially claimed the Mafia queen. And tomorrow, Chicago was going to bleed for it. The morning sun bled through the heavy curtains of the penthouse. It painted the tangled white sheets in harsh lines of gold and gray. I woke up before Harper, my internal clock permanently set to military time. My bruised ribs ached with a dull, familiar throbbing. But for the first time in days, my mind was completely quiet. Harper was curled tightly against my chest, her dark hair spilling across my collarbone. The heavy, suffocating scent of syndicate violence was gone from the room. It was replaced entirely by the deep, bonded mixture of vanilla and dark pine. I traced the line of her spine with calloused fingers. She let out a soft, contented murmur in her sleep and pressed closer to my warmth. I wanted to stay in this bed forever, but a blinking red light on the secure satellite phone shattered the illusion. I carefully untangled myself from her grasp and slipped out of bed. I pulled on a pair of dark tactical pants and answered the encrypted line. It was Sal, his voice low and tight with adrenaline. "Vittorio Moretti called a gathering of his remaining capos," Sal reported. "They are regrouping at his private estate in Lake Forest." I looked back at the bed. Harper was already sitting up, clutching the white sheet to her chest. Her dark eyes were wide awake, instantly shifting from a sleepy Omega to a calculating boss. "When?" I asked, putting the phone on speaker. "Tonight," Sal answered. "They are planning a coordinated strike on our South Side territories." Harper stood up, abandoning the sheet. She walked over to the glass table, completely unbothered by her nakedness. "Tell the men to stand down, Sal," Harper ordered coldly. "We are not fighting them in the streets anymore." She picked up a digital pen and tapped a location on the electronic map. "We are cutting the head off the snake." The Lake Forest estate was a fortress disguised as a luxury mansion. It sat on 20 acres of heavily wooded land bordering Lake Michigan. It was surrounded by a 10-foot wrought iron fence and armed private security. An exterior assault would require a small army and result in a massive firefight. "You can't breach that perimeter cleanly," I stated, analyzing the topographic layout. "They have thermal cameras on the tree line and roving dog patrols." Harper pulled a silk robe over her shoulders and tied it tightly. "I don't need to breach the perimeter," she said calmly. "Vittorio is an arrogant, traditional alpha." She looked up at me, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous intelligence. "If the vulnerable Omega heir of the Rossi family asks for a parley to discuss surrender, he will open the front gates himself." My blood ran instantly cold. A heavy, territorial growl tore its way out of my throat before I could stop it. "Absolutely not," I snapped, stepping into her personal space. "I am not letting you walk into a house full of Moretti hitters as bait." Harper didn't back down. She reached out and placed both hands flat against my bare chest. "I won't be alone, Sloane," she whispered, looking deep into my eyes. "You are going to be my shadow." The plan was incredibly reckless, but it was tactically sound. The front gates were heavily guarded against a hostile approach. But the rear of the estate backed directly onto a steep limestone bluff over the lake. They didn't patrol the cliffs because they deemed them completely unscalable. They didn't factor in a Tier 1 operative with climbing gear and a lethal motive. By midnight, the wind, whipping off Lake Michigan, was brutally cold. I was waist-deep in freezing water, dressed in a sleek black wetsuit and tactical harness. A suppressed Heckler & Koch MP7 submachine gun was strapped tightly to my chest. I watched the headlights of Harper's armored Cadillac pull up to the front gates of the estate. My earpiece crackled softly with the secure audio feed from her hidden microphone. "I am here to see Vittorio," Harper's voice echoed in my ear. She sounded small, frightened, and perfectly submissive. It was a brilliant, terrifying performance. The heavy iron gates groaned open. I didn't wait another second. I pulled myself out of the freezing water and began the brutal ascent up the limestone cliff. My fingers clamped onto the jagged rocks, my muscles burning with intense exhaustion. I moved silently, calculating every single handhold. I reached the top of the bluff in less than 12 minutes. I hauled myself over the edge and melted instantly into the shadows of the manicured gardens. 2 armed sentries were smoking cigarettes near the stone patio. I drew my combat knife and moved up behind them like a ghost. I took the first man down with a swift strike to the carotid artery. I caught his falling body and lowered him silently to the grass. The second man turned, his eyes widening in shock. I drove the pommel of my knife hard into his temple. He collapsed instantly without making a single sound. "I am inside the perimeter," I whispered into my throat mic. "I am in the main study," Harper's voice replied softly. "Vittorio is making me wait. There are 4 guards in the room." I moved swiftly toward the rear of the massive mansion. I bypassed the locked French doors and scaled the stone trellis leading to the second-floor balcony. I picked the lock on the master bedroom window in under 10 seconds. The interior of the house smelled of expensive cigars, old money, and hostile alpha pheromones. I moved down the carpeted hallway, a silent shadow dispensing swift, non-lethal force to anyone in my path. I reached the heavy oak doors of the main study. I pressed my back against the wall, listening to the muffled voices inside. "You look exactly like your mother, Harper," Vittorio Moretti's deep, glooming voice echoed. "Too soft for this business. You should have stayed in your greenhouse." I heard Harper let out a carefully orchestrated, trembling sigh. She was releasing a heavy dose of distressed omega pheromones. It was a biological distraction designed to make the alphas in the room lower their guard. "I just want the bloodshed to stop, Vittorio," Harper pleaded softly. "My father is dying. We can't sustain this war." Vittorio laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that made my trigger finger itch violently. "You don't get to negotiate a truce, little girl," Vittorio sneered. "You sign over the shipping ports, and maybe I'll let you leave Chicago alive." I checked the chamber of my MP7 one last time. "Take the deal, boss," I heard a familiar, panicked voice say over the audio feed. It was Marcus, the Rossi guard who had ambushed us in the alley 6 months ago. He had betrayed her. He had sold out his own Omega boss to the Moretti family. My alpha instincts roared to life, violently rejecting the concept of restraint. "I think I need a moment to consider my options," Harper said. Her voice was no longer trembling. The distressed vanilla scent vanished instantly over the audio feed. I could hear the sudden, terrified shift in the room's atmosphere. The suffocating, metallic ozone of an apex predator flooded the study. "What is this?" Vittorio demanded, his voice suddenly laced with genuine panic. "This is my final offer," Harper whispered coldly. That was the signal. I kicked the heavy oak doors open with shattering force. The massive wooden panels slammed against the interior walls like a thunderclap. I stepped into the room, my MP7 raised and locked onto the closest threat. There were 4 Moretti hitters in the room, plus Vittorio and the traitor Marcus. They were all completely paralyzed by the sudden, violent intrusion. I squeezed the trigger in a controlled 3-round burst. The suppressed weapon coughed quietly. 2 Moretti guards dropped to the floor before they even realized they were under attack. The remaining 2 hitters reached frantically for their weapons. I pivoted smoothly on my heel, shifting my aim with practiced, lethal precision. 2 more quick bursts. 2 more bodies hit the expensive Persian rug. Vittorio Moretti scrambled backward, tripping over his heavy leather desk chair. He looked at me with wide, completely terrified eyes.
I stood in the center of the room, dripping freezing lake water onto the hardwood floor. My dark pine pheromones filled the enclosed space, viciously suppressing every alpha left breathing. I leveled the smoking barrel of my weapon directly at Vittorio's head. Marcus stood frozen in the corner, his hands shaking violently.
Harper sat calmly in a plush leather armchair across from Vittorio's desk. She didn't flinch at the sudden violence. She gracefully crossed her legs, smoothing the fabric of her dark slacks. She looked like a queen surveying her newly conquered territory. "As I was saying, Vittorio," Harper continued, her voice dangerously soft. She picked up a crystal tumbler of whiskey from the desk and took a slow sip. "The bloodshed stops tonight." Vittorio stared at the 4 dead men bleeding onto his floor. He finally looked at Harper, recognizing the absolute monster sitting in front of him. "You're insane," Vittorio gasped, clutching his chest. Harper smiled. It was a cold, terrifying expression that sent a shiver down my own spine. "No, Vittorio," Harper corrected gently. She set the crystal glass back down on the desk with a definitive clink. "I am just very well protected." I stepped forward, keeping my crosshairs locked firmly on the Moretti boss. The war wasn't completely over yet. But the scales of power in Chicago had just been violently, irrevocably tipped. The heavy silence in the study was broken only by Vittorio's ragged breathing. He stared at the barrel of my MP7, completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in power. 4 of his best hitters were dead on the floor. His fortified estate had been compromised by a single, lethal operative. Harper remained perfectly still in the plush leather chair. She looked entirely, completely at home, surrounded by the carnage. "I am waiting, Vittorio," Harper said, her voice smooth and devoid of pity. "You have 2 options tonight. Sign over the port authorities and the Southside Transit routes." She leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand. "Or I let my alpha paint this beautiful room with your brains." Vittorio swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically toward the door. "My men will hear the gunfire," he bluffed weakly. "You won't make it out." I shifted my stance, the wet neoprene of my suit squeaking faintly. "I used subsonic rounds and a custom suppressor," I informed him coldly. "Your men outside are either unconscious or bleeding out in the garden." Vittorio's shoulders finally slumped in utter defeat. His traditional alpha pride broke completely under the weight of his own mortality. He slowly reached into the top drawer of his massive desk. I tensed my finger on the trigger, ready to fire at the slightest hostile movement. But he only pulled out a heavy gold pen. Harper reached into her dark designer coat and retrieved a folded document. She slid it across the polished mahogany desk. Vittorio picked up the pen with trembling fingers. He scrawled his signature hastily on the bottom line, signing away his empire. He pushed the paper back toward her, looking suddenly 10 years older. "Take it," Vittorio spat bitterly. "You are just like your father, Harper." "No, Vittorio," Harper corrected quietly, carefully folding the document. "My father was merciful. I am not." She stood up from the leather chair and turned her attention to the corner of the room. Marcus was pressing his back tightly against the bookshelf, shaking uncontrollably. He was sweating profusely, his scent reeking of raw terror and guilt. "Miss Rossi, please," Marcus begged, his voice cracking. "Meriti threatened my family. He said he would kill my daughter if I didn't feed him your location." Harper stopped walking, standing a few feet away from the traitor. The terrifying metallic ozone scent spiked violently in the room. It was heavy, judgmental, and completely devoid of forgiveness. "I threatened your family too, Marcus," Harper reminded him softly. "The night you cornered me in that alley." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking down his face. "You made a calculated risk," Harper continued, her tone completely clinical. You gambled that Vittorio was the more dangerous monster. She looked back at me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. She didn't give a verbal order. She didn't have to. Our bond was absolute, forged in violence and sealed with shared blood. I shifted my aim smoothly from Vittorio to Marcus. I squeezed the trigger once. The suppressed weapon coughed. Marcus collapsed instantly against the bookshelf, sliding limply to the floor. Vittorio flinched violently at the sudden execution. Leave Chicago by tomorrow morning, Vittorio, Harper ordered, not looking back at the body. If I ever smell your scent in my city again, she will end you. She turned and walked gracefully toward the shattered oak doors. I kept my weapon raised, walking backward until we were both out in the highway. The mansion was completely silent as we made our extraction. We walked out the front doors, stepping over the unconscious bodies of the remaining guards. The armored Cadillac was waiting patiently in the circular driveway. We climbed into the back seat, the heavy doors sealing us off from the freezing night. Take us home, Miller, Harper instructed quietly. The heavy SUV accelerated down the long, winding driveway, leaving the fallen empire behind. I leaned the MP7 against the floorboards and exhaled a long, shaky breath. The adrenaline crash hit me like a physical blow. My wet tactical suit was freezing against my skin, and my ribs throbbed mercilessly. Harper shifted across the leather seat and slid her arms around my waist. She buried her face in the cold, wet neoprene covering my chest. You're freezing, she murmured, her voice finally losing its metallic, commanding edge. I've been colder, I replied, resting my chin on top of her head. The drive back to the Gold Coast was a quiet blur. Dawn was just beginning to break as we pulled into the secure underground garage. The sky over Lake Michigan was painted in pale streaks of violet and gray. The city was waking up, completely unaware that its entire underworld had just violently changed hands. We rode the encrypted elevator up to the penthouse in complete silence. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind us, securing the perimeter. I immediately unclipped the heavy tactical harness and let it drop to the floor. I peeled off the freezing wet suit, leaving me shivering in my dark undergarments. Harper didn't go to the kitchen or the war room. She walked straight into the master bathroom and turned on the heavy brass fixtures in the massive shower. Steam quickly filled the glass enclosure, smelling of expensive lavender and hot water. She walked back out and took my cold hand in hers. She led me into the bathroom, ignoring the grime I was tracking onto the marble floor. She helped me strip off the remaining wet clothing. She was incredibly careful around the dark purple bruising on my ribs. We stepped into the hot shower together. The scalding water hit my freezing skin, sending violent shudders through my tired muscles. Harper picked up a bars of expensive soap and began to wash the lake water from my shoulders. She washed the gunpowder residue from my hands. She washed the blood of her enemies off my skin. It was a deeply intimate, silently profound ritual of cleansing. I stood under the heavy spray, watching the dark water swirl down the marble drain. It's over, Harper whispered, her hands smoothing over my tense back. Vittorio is broken. The capos will fall in line completely now. I turned around in the tight space to face her. Her dark hair was plastered to her beautiful face, the water running down her collarbone. She looked absolutely exhausted, but there was a new, undeniable peace in her eyes. She was no longer the hunted heir. She was the undisputed queen. The war might be over, but the throne is always bloody, Harper, I warned her softly. I reached out and brushed a wet strand of hair behind her ear. Someone will always try to take it from you. Let them try, she replied, stepping closer until our wet bodies pressed together. The sweet, intoxicating scent of vanilla mixed heavily with the hot steam. They don't have my alpha, I wrapped my arms completely around her, resting my forehead against hers. I closed my eyes, letting the hot water wash away the last remnants of my old life. I was no longer Sloane, the private security contractor. I was completely and irrevocably hers. I was the monster that hid in her shadow, waiting to tear apart anyone who threatened her peace. I will kill anyone who tries to hurt you, I promised, my voice a fierce, rumbling vow. I know, she murmured softly against my wet lips. She tilted her head up, capturing my mouth in a slow, deep kiss. It wasn't desperate or frantic like the light in the elevator. It was absolute, steady, and utterly consuming. It was the kiss of a woman who finally had everything she ever wanted. I backed her gently against the warm glass of the shower wall. My alpha pheromones flared, mingling perfectly with her omega scent. We didn't need words anymore. Our bodies communicated the depth of the trauma and the triumph we had just shared. We stayed in the hot shower until the water began to cool. We dried each other off in the quiet, steamy bathroom. I carried her to the massive king-sized bed and pulled the thick white duvet over us. The morning sunlight was now streaming brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It illuminated the gilded cage that was now our absolute fortress. Harper curled tightly against my side, her head resting directly over my heart. Her breathing evened out quickly, pulling her into a deep, exhausted sleep. I stayed awake a little longer, watching the city traffic far below on Lakeshore Drive. The violent storm had finally passed. A new, terrifying era had officially begun in Chicago. I tightened my grip on the sleeping Mafia queen in my arms. I was an alpha who had finally found her permanent home, and heaven help anyone who ever tried to burn it down.
This story proves that a true Omega isn't defined by softness, and a true Alpha isn't just about dominance. Power lies in what you are willing to burn down to protect the woman you love. Harper and Sloane shattered their biological chains to rule Chicago together. If you enjoyed this dark, high-stakes Mafia GL romance, please give this video a massive thumbs up. Your support helps grow Taylor's Secret Library, where we celebrate powerful women-loving women's stories. Hit subscribe and ring the bell. Next week, I'm bringing you a slow-burn Ice Queen CEO romance, where a ruthless boss finally meets her fiercely independent match. What was your favorite moment? Harper's chilling reveal in the alleyway? Or Sloane's ultimate surrender in the elevator? Tell me in the comments. I read them all. Until next time, stay dangerous, and I'll see you in the next story.